This session will be chaired by a friend of Georgetown and the center, Dr. Tamar Hassan from William & Mary University. And actually, unfortunately, Hatem Azam is ill and couldn't come. But we happen to have another person we thought would be very interesting for you to hear from. So we'll be replacing him with another speaker who will be up here shortly. And we'll go, hopefully we'll finish the panel by around 5:15, then we'll have question and answer. So without further ado, Tamara, you can introduce the speakers.
Thank you, Jack. I'm just wondering if we have our fifth speaker coming up. Oh, good, thank you. Yes, so our concluding session, Restoration of Democracy and the Rule of Law in Egypt, the roles of the pro-democracy groups and the international community. Our five speakers, I think we'll go in the original order. So we'll start with Abdelmawgoud Darderi, a former FJP member of parliament, who will be speaking on understanding the anti-coup perspective, critical factors of success and failure. And second will be Nahla Nasser, who is a French-Egyptian spokesperson for Egyptians Abroad for Democracy Worldwide, a group that was founded in Raba'a, where she spent 30 days in the sit-in. She has a master's in engineering, or you are a master's student?
No, I have a master's.
She has a master's in engineering and is headquartered in Paris?
Yes.
Alhamdulillah. Good, got that right. And next would be Dr. Nathan Brown, George Washington University, who will be speaking on the role of the international community in restoring democracy and the rule of law in Egypt. Then Dalia Mogahid, who is chairperson and CEO of Mogahid Consulting, speaking on the role of pro-democracy groups in restoring democracy and the rule of law in Egypt, or something like that. I think all of us may be shifting a little bit our comments because as the final panel, there have been so many fascinating things being brought up and a lot of them are overlapping, so there will be an effort, I think, on the part of a lot of us to really pull strings together. So feel free to be flexible in your focus. And then our final speaker will be, we're very blessed to have him with us today from American University in Cairo, Imad Shaheen, speaking on essential elements of any political initiative to resolve the Egyptian stalemate. Each will speak for 15 minutes, and we'll try to be careful about our time limits as our predecessors have done. We will not have the concluding remarks, so if each speaks for 15 minutes, then we'll be able to have time for Q&A. So let us begin with our first speaker, Dr. Abdelmawgoud Darderi.
I would like to thank the organizers for providing me with this opportunity to be able to share with you, as a member of the Egyptian parliament, what went on in the past 3 years or past decade or past my life experience. I would like to say I am really happy to be here. My first time I came to the United States, I came to do masters in linguistics and PhD in linguistics. After I did my masters, I found the conflict between so-called Muslims and the West, or the West and Muslims. I decided to change my major. So I went and I did my PhD in cultural studies. And I wrote my dissertation on is there a third alternative from Islamism versus Eurocentrism? Can we really work on a third alternative? I believed in the possibility of working on a third alternative. I loved living here in America for so long, and I went back to Egypt to teach with lots of hopes. But when I went back to Egypt, I found a police state, a state of fear. And as a teacher, I couldn't help it, because I believe if education does not change us, it becomes useless. We repeat ourselves in an educational platform. The first challenge I met was critical thinking. Political operation does not teach critical thinking. And I used to teach 2 classes, one on cultural studies, the other one on critical discourse. So my first actual experience after so many years being away from Egypt was to help the students of Egypt to think critically of the relationship between Egypt as part of the Arab and Muslim world and the United States students and the United States culture. So I developed some internet programs. And this is very much related to what I am going to do with the restoration of democracy and the rule of law. But the specific example, when I assigned a project to the students to go, I come from Luxor. Luxor is a tourist city. And I teach in the English department. I wanted the students to practice English, but also, honestly speaking, I wanted them to be engaged with Western ideas so that they can develop critical understanding, not only of their own, but also of the Western culture. That was a great project. The students went to the Temple of Karnak. I live very close to the Temple of Karnak, and went to Luxor, to different places, but their unfortunate situation, they were met by a police officer, confiscated the tape recorder, and took the 2 female students for interrogation. That was a big scandal. In my school, in my department, I became the sole responsible. The head of the security apparatus where I teach called upon me and said, "What are you doing? This is a national security issue." And then the university president told me, "You have to stop this project." That was first experience. That was around 2003. And I insisted on going on with teaching the students how to think critically. So I started teaching novels like Animal Farm. That gave me lots of space to be able to criticize, but still talk about the Animal Farm. Then I started teaching plays by Henrik Ibsen, The Enemy of the People, or George Bernard Shaw, Saint John. And I started asking the students to bring examples of Saint John in the Egyptian, Arab, or Muslim culture. Egyptians have been suffering for centuries, for decades. You cannot imagine what it means to live under a police state. We were so fearful. We developed an example, a proverb that says, "Al-hitan liha udan," walls have ears. So we couldn't even talk in a closed room. Because if rooms have ears, most likely whatever we talk about can reach the police apparatus, and that can end you up in jail for years. Who knows what will happen to you? It was that context. To talk about restoring democracy is very important to understand what happened before the January 25th revolution, what we were living under. The economic situation was terrible. I know people, my neighbors, were living under less than 200 Egyptian pounds, which is less than $30 a month. And then you can talk about the medical services, the educational services, all other services. For you who visited Egypt can easily tell that those people are living under deprivation. The Egyptian revolution presented a dream. When I spoke here at Georgetown 2 years ago, I spoke of the Egyptian dream. The dream to be free. The dream to be able to speak your mind, to be able to travel freely. The dream to be able to participate in a democratic process. I always believe that you cannot have economic development unless you have free people first. Free political atmosphere has to go first, because that gives the essence of humanity to the Egyptian people. We believed in the Egyptian revolution. We all gathered together. But we knew what we were against. We did not know what we were for. We were against one thing, الشعب يريد إسقاط النظام. We really knew this very well. We wanted to bring down the system, not just the Mubarak, but the whole system. But we didn't know how, strategically speaking, technically speaking. We knew that if we can stay in the streets as long as it takes, we will be able to bring the system down. All of us participated being in the streets. Everyone did in their own ways. Not only the people in Cairo and Alexandria, but people at home, even sitting in front of TVs were participating because they were fearful even to go outside. The revolution went on. On February 11th, Mubarak came down, but the system didn't. And I think on March 19th, when there was a referendum, that was the beginning of the challenge for the revolution. It was the referendum because it moved the spirit of the country from a revolutionary mode into a reform mode. There were two agendas, and of course behind them was the military. The first agenda was the reform agenda, the Muslim Brotherhood agenda, the political parties agenda, but there was the revolutionary spirit that the session before spoke about. The revolutionary were idealistic. They wanted to really change, but they wanted also quick change. The expectations became very high. The reform movement, after the referendum on March 19, 2011, started taking a course of formal democracy. The revolutionaries were not very happy with the formal democracy. It is long, it is gradual, it did not deliver as it expected to deliver. When I ran for the election, everyone wanted the changes the next year that they will be able to get their own apartment, they will be able to get their own car, and they will be able to get married. That was their expectation. We couldn't do that. We realized once we went to the parliament that the rest of the system is still there. But we believed in the democratic process. We wanted it to go forward. Because through the democratic process, we'll be able to tackle all the challenges facing us in Egypt. Unfortunately, the political players fail to understand that this has to take a compromise, a consensus, all the political players, including the Freedom and Justice Party. Everyone. We thought that, hey, this is the chance to do what you can to present your agenda and to do it through the majority. Unfortunately, the other political forces thought maybe there is another way. Let us side with the military. And siding with the military was thought of as an easier way, a faster way to bring the real change so that the military will move the Muslim Brotherhood or the Freedom and Justice Party. In fact, Morsi did not rule with a Morsi government. He ruled with a national unity government. Only 30% of the ministers during Morsi's time were from the Freedom and Justice Party. The rest of the ministers were either from the old regime, technocrats from other parties as well. So it was a unity, but the challenges facing that government were tremendous. Many of the political forces did not realize that the forces of the old regime were still there. Who are they, the forces? Military was there. The military was watching all the time how things are going and even the possibility of dividing and rule over the rest of the political establishment. Then the police officer. The police officer refused to work during Morsi's years. They provide a state of insecurity. They made people fearful of the new changes. In fact, they made people did not appreciate what did the revolution do to us? A young man will meet me and say, what did you do? Tourism is not there. There is no security. And services are not provided because the old state was blocking any changes in the country. And then the judiciary. And then the state bureaucrats. Of course, that whip helped with the media, the business establishment. They created a state of failure. Some may not like say that Morsi failed. I say no. He was made to fail. You know, let me just give you one example. The gas station. There was a problem in the gas distribution. Most of the gas stations are owned by the army. And if the army decides to shut them, there is no gas in the country. And imagine I stood sometimes 4 hours to fill up the tank. Whom I get angry against? Morsi. It is Morsi. Everything in the country, if the train comes late, you know what? It's Morsi. If the teacher does not come on time to the class, again, it is Morsi. So Morsi became the embodiment of failure. He was made to look like an embodiment of failure. But in spite of this, we lived a very good year. because we lived in a democracy. We were able to move around. We were able to hold meetings everywhere we could. We used to spend hours in political discussion. I remember the constitution that was approved by 64% of those who participated in it. I remember I took the constitution and discussed it in the villages of Egypt. The villages, everyone will come with their own copy and discuss it. That was the Egypt that we were working for. I saw young Egyptians going to the streets to clean them up because they had this sense of belonging. They felt that Egypt is there. That democratic process, for those who were concerned about the political development and the democratic process, were really happy with the process. Of course, there were not a lot of services being provided to the masses, but only few understood, because the media bombardment, I would, example, march in the streets for something, they would put me on a TV and they would say I was marching against the thing that I was marching for. And you couldn't help it. You wait until for a day or two until you tell them, hopefully they will be able to retract it or not. That was the situation in Egypt. It was still a learning experience. Morsi did not run for an office before. That is the first time. First time we had an election, a free election, democratic election. We were so happy. First time we had the president of our own. First time we were able to elect our own president. First time we were able to participate. You cannot imagine the beauty and the happiness of people standing in lines so that they cast their votes. I was there. I was there when I saw people in the small units of election. We would be there, members of other parties will be there with the judge, and after the judge finishes, he counts the votes, we take a statement from him saying, it is clear now. We were sure that our votes meant a lot. And we were happy in spite of all the economic challenges we faced. The story is long, but let me stop here and tell you what happened on June 30th. June 30th was a great democratic process in Egypt. I was so happy. I was there in Tahrir Square myself. As a member of the Freedom and Justice Party, I was there to see what's going on. I was so happy that many Egyptians are going against the president. Before that, we couldn't even say anything against the president. But we all became sad on July 3rd. July 3rd has no relation with June 30th, but the military used June 30th to find excuses to come and put an end to the democratic process. What did the July 3rd, the coup, the bloody coup, what did it do? It kidnapped the president, the first ever elected president. Yes, Morsi made mistakes. Who can? I wonder if he didn't make mistakes, he should make mistakes. Who does not make mistakes, especially when you're newly elected, first time, and a culture does not have a democratic tradition in a transitional period where the rest of the regime is still working against him. But he was democratically elected. He was kidnapped, and he was put in jail. Against the will of the Egyptian people. By whom? By his defense minister. And the defense minister appoints another president. That president makes that general makes him marshal, and then he will make him a president later on. You see the game, but that game did not come as an innocent game. It came with blood, lots of blood from Egyptian people. And then the Shura Council, the upper house, was suspended, was dissolved. The constitution was suspended. Thousands of people got killed, not only in Rab'a, but also in other places. Media outlets were shut down. We were shocked what was going on. No one believed anyone was liable to be arrested and put in jail for as long as they want. There was no rule of law. So talking about restoring democracy and restoring the rule of law, it is very important we understand what happened before. Now, where do we go from here? Scenarios are many. And many people can easily point finger. You made a mistake. No, you made a mistake. And everyone is trying to say, the other person made a mistake. I believe all of us made mistakes. And that challenge, it is an ethical fallacy to talk now about Morsi's mistakes when your fellow Egyptians are being killed in the streets of Egypt. Let us watch out. Let us not divide Egyptians again. It is high time now for Egyptians to come together. to work together and to focus on a process. The challenge is to have a process and then respect the process, respect the rules of the game. We cannot change the rule of the game every time we don't like the people who are being elected. The challenges and the scenarios are many. Possible scenario is a lose-lose situation. Everyone loses. Now the situation in Egypt, everyone is losing. The people are losing, the pro-democracy forces are losing, the military is also, the country is losing. If this continues for some time, that can easily lead to failed state. Failed state in Egypt is dangerous not only to Egypt, but to the surrounding area in that part of the world. There is another scenario of having the Algerian alternative, or the Syrian alternative, or the Iranian alternatives. Hopefully, that Egyptians will be able to develop an Egyptian alternative. I would like to conclude by the following. There are so many players inside the country of Egypt. Egyptians have the larger responsibility. Egyptians have to be able to sort out their differences and come on a common ground and develop a better alternative other than the status quo. Yes, there are regional players. Yes, there are international players. Egyptians are disappointed at how the Saudis or the United Arab Emirates are doing, but they're more disappointed. They feel sense of betrayal from the Western power and from the United States. Because at the end of the day, Saudi and United Arab Emirates are not democratic countries. They do not know the values of democracy or the rule of law. But how come Europe and the United States betrays the wishes and the feelings of the Egyptian people? There was a lot of expectation that Europe and the United States will be able to give an ultimatum to the military. You go back the same as on the 25th of January. You either go back to the barracks or relations are cut so that democracy can move forward. Democracy is a win-win situation. We all can win in a democracy. Egyptians can win, the military can win, America can win, Europe can win, and the rest of the surrounding. Israel, of course, is still insisting on being the only democracy in the area. But we insist that there can be many other democracies in the area. And democracies will be able to move forward. I am very hopeful that we will be able, if Egyptians can resort their own agendas and be able to come and agree on a common agenda, they will be able to produce a better alternative to counter this violence, this bloody coup, so that we all can move forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Daderi.
Thank you.
And next we have Dr. Nathan Brown from George Washington University.
All right, thank you very much, and I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me. Unfortunately, because of other duties, I was only able to come fairly recently, so I only came halfway through the last session. And you said we're supposed to wrap up, but I don't know what was said before, so there's a real danger that either I will, A, repeat things that said before and therefore be boring, or B, say something that is new but probably outlandish if nobody thought of saying it before. So I'm going to be either boring or wrong, or perhaps half and half. Yeah, all right. So the topic is, what I can do is be, as a good academic, thank you, is begin by arguing with the title, okay? This is a panel on restoration of democracy and the rule of law, and I'm supposed to talk about the role of the international community. I will get to the role of the international community, but of course restoration assumes that these things existed in Egypt at some point. Democracy, I think, in a sense, existed in some senses. That is to say, if anybody who watched Egyptian society, not simply in 2011, but in the years before and the years since, could see that there was a democratic ethos within the society in terms of the vitality of public debate, the freedom by which people express themselves. And there were democratic procedures in the sense that there have been elections, one after another, and Egyptians are not done voting yet this year. They begin with an election and they're going to have two more. But democracy in the sense of an established system of government in which there are accepted rules of the game for contesting political office has not existed, and in a sense that's one of the problems. Rule of law, I would sort of say something well, I would almost the exact opposite. Rule of law can mean many, many different things. But one of the things I think that's important to note is that when you're talking about the Egyptian legal framework, you're talking about one that has grown up under decade after decade of authoritarian rule. And therefore, authoritarian practices are deeply embedded within the Egyptian legal and even the judicial order. So it's not a matter of simply observing the law in order to realize the rule of law or democracy or human rights. Sometimes following the letter of the law can lead you in the opposite direction. And one of the big problems, I think, for Egypt is, in a sense, that when each new party comes into a position of political power, they find that the tools that they decried when they were in the hands of their opponents are suddenly useful in their terms. Something like what happened in France when the left decried the strong presidency that de Gaulle created, and then when Mitterrand won the presidency in 1981, suddenly discovered that maybe a strong presidency was a nice thing after all. Or to be more loyal to Egyptian history, the WAFT denouncing the way that the 1923 Constitution was written, and then the second the 1923 Constitution got suspended, demanding its restoration. And there's some sort of sequence like that in Egyptian political life, in which, as I say, those people who attain positions of political authority actually in some do not really contest the deeply authoritarian practices built into the Egyptian legal and constitutional framework. The basic underlying problem, I think, in Egyptian political life therefore, is not the absence of voting. It's not the absence of a democratic society. It's not Egypt is a very highly legalistic place in some ways. The basic problem, basic failure in Egyptian life, it seems to me, is a failure of politics. And when I get to that point and out of that sentence, you're probably thinking, okay, this is where he's not being boring by repeating it. This is where he's just being wrong. How can anybody who's been to Egypt in the last few years say this country needs more politics? That's all people talk about, that's all people think about, that's all people do. And I don't mean that they need more politics, but I think what they need is a different form of politics. Or let me put it a little different. It's not that there's not enough politics, but a failure, I think, to appreciate the fact of pluralism in Egyptian political life. Egyptians are very accustomed to seeing their societies very homogeneous, and perhaps by some international standards it is. But the fact is that Egyptians differ very greatly on all sorts of things in the political realm, and they're not used to and do not have structures for sorting out those differences. So when I go back and talk about, and don't worry, I'm not going to do it, every single misdeed of the last 3 years, there would be plenty of people to blame. And in fact, there's almost everybody to blame. And if you've got a situation where there is everybody to blame, then it in a sense means that there's nobody to blame. Every time I say that there's, in that sense, nobody to blame, then one party that thinks the other party is to blame begins to blame me. And I begin to think maybe I should go back to writing on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to cut down on my hate mail. But I think that there's some fundamental truth to that. That is to say, the departures from democratic practice and the departures from a fealty to more liberal conceptions of the rule of law are very widespread in Egypt. And if you take a look, for instance, at the charges that were made, Dr. Darderi talked about, yes, Morsi made mistakes. If you were to talk about what some of those mistakes would be, I think some of them might be, for instance, the decision to completely postpone the issue of security service reform, the decision essentially not to even raise the issue of civilian control of the military. I think those are very, very fair criticisms. It sounds a little bit odd, however, to be making those criticisms after June 30th or July 3rd, whichever date you want to pick, when those people who have taken over Egypt since that time are guilty of the same offenses. You could say, if you were uncharitable, many times over. I'm not uncharitable, so I won't say it. But you certainly have the same kinds of patterns of political mistakes or misdeeds repeated by everybody. So where is this kind of weakness coming from? I said before that it's a failure to accept the fact of pluralism in Egyptian political life. And I see that partly as a legacy of decades and decades and decades of authoritarian rule. the weakness of political society. The fact is that when Mubarak fell in January 2011, the basic structures of democratic political life were very weakly established in Egypt. A very weak party system, in essence, an anemic, almost non-existent political party system, and an inability, I think, by all kinds of political groups that had sometimes fairly coherent and fairly good visions of where to move the country, to translate those abstract visions into concrete political strategies. A tendency in many times in Egyptian political life to talk past each other. That is to say, what really strikes me about rhetoric in Egyptian political life today is the degree to which various, I find very, very few Egyptian political actors who attempt to cast their arguments in the public realm towards people who disagree with them. There's very little attempt at persuasion and an awful lot of attempt of kind of riling up your own camp. And again, a very strong history of dealing, in a sense, directly with the state and with those people in authority. And that pattern set in very early, immediately after 2011, when rather than essentially banding together the civilian political forces that had just brought down Mubarak, there was a race among them, in essence, to come to privileged arrangements with various parts of the state that still held some authority. And again, I don't hold any particular party responsible for that. They all did it. They all bear some responsibility. And so what you have is a political process, I think, that's certainly to some extent since 2011, and certainly since last summer, has actually weakened those problems. It has driven Egyptian society, members of Egyptian society, even more into competing kind of self-contained camps, and it has entrenched these basic structures of the Egyptian state, the judiciary, the religious establishment, the military, the security services, and so on, and placed them outside of the political process so that they stand kind of above enforcing their vision of the proper political order, sometimes with great brutality, on a society that stands, in a sense, almost powerless and certainly divided in front of them. Okay, so I've diagnosed Egyptian politics, but I'm supposed to talk about the international role, and it sounds as if this is kind of a bad situation. And in a sense, I think it is a bad situation. I do not expect democracy to be, to use the title here, restored, or I do not expect democracy to arise in Egypt any time soon. I still do think, and I'm going to get a little bit generally, but I still do think that there is a role for the international community here. And let me just mention two, and again, I'll speak fairly generally. Number one is to avoid participating in or endorsing the delegitimization that is so much a part of Egyptian political discourse and practice today. The message from the international community, I think, can actually be that various forces in Egyptian political life have to learn to deal with each other. And the second is the second, I think, important lesson is, again, a little bit of a vague one. But I've often remarked about how it is that the Egypt that is talked about in gatherings such as this, in international gatherings, if you talk to diplomats, if you talk to journalists, if you talk to academics or pundits about Egypt, they would talk now about a country that is in deep crisis. And you go to Egypt and you talk to people who are comfortable with the new political order, and that's a very considerable part of the population. And they're talking about a completely different country. There is an absolute disconnect, a remarkable disconnect, between the way that Egyptians talk about their country, not all Egyptians, but many Egyptians, and the way that it is talked about internationally. And in a sense, the atmosphere, the resulting atmosphere reminds me something of, as an American, something of the atmosphere in this country after 9/11, where you had this sort of burst of patriotism and a sort of an emergency, sort of a state of emergency mentality. I'm not even talking about the legal and institutional measures taken, but a state of emergency mentality. And this country did some stupid things as a result. which I won't name, but I think we could all come up with some of the things. When a country as rich and powerful as the United States does stupid things, people in other countries often suffer. When a country that is poor and exposed, like Egypt, does stupid things, Egyptians suffer. And I'm worried that that is what is happening today. And that disconnect is, in a sense, something I think to build on. And I'm not going to say in any particular way, but when Egyptian officials find that one of the most anodyne structures in international affairs, the Secretary Generalship of the United Nations, starts issuing worried statements about the course of domestic Egyptian politics, the short-term reaction will be extremely angry. What are you doing talking about domestic affairs? Long term, I think this can have a healthy effect in communicating the deep concern of the international community. And the way that the argument, I think, can sometimes be made in a policy context, and in fact is most effectively made in a policy context, is not simply in terms of international human rights standards, although those needs to be named. It's not simply in terms of democracy, although that needs to be talked about. But it is also in terms of basic stability in the country. That was my phone? Thank you. I'm sorry. I was wondering who that jerk was.
Guess who was calling? Watch it.
All right. Okay. I withdraw everything I've said. Okay. All right. The argument, I think, can be made very much in terms of stability. And again, there's a little bit of a disconnect here. If you follow discussions about the international community, particularly about the United States, in Egypt today, you'll find a very, very sharp suspicion of American motives, and there's a long history in back of that that is perhaps understandable. But it seems to be, in one sense, very, very strange. Concerns that what the United States is trying to do is to divide the country and this sort of thing. And I participate in discussions here, and all I hear about is incredible concern about the stability of the country, that this is a society that looks like it's about to tear itself apart. And my sense is a little bit closer, I think, to the way that my sense of Egyptian society is perhaps a little bit closer to the way that it is talked about, as I said, in international circles. It's remarkable to me that when I make an argument like this to an Egyptian audience, and an Egyptian audience that is sympathetic to that uses the date July 3rd, let me put it that way, or an Egyptian audience that uses the date June 30th as a transformation date. That is on both sides of the great political divide of Egyptian political life. And I talk about basically, or when international actors talk about the need for reconciliation in Egyptian political life, they get the same message back again. You don't understand what we're dealing with, and you don't understand who you're dealing with. And I think the international message should be essentially, yes, we do understand who you're dealing with. You're dealing with each other. And you've got to do that, basically for your own sake and for the world's sake. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Brown. You better check your messages. Our third speaker will be Dalia Mogahed, Chairperson and CEO of Mogahed Consulting.
Good afternoon, and thank you for sticking it out till the end of the day. I think we have the difficult task of both saying something new and summarizing all of what we've heard today. I'm going to take a slightly different angle on the discussion and talk about what I would call the crisis in Egypt from the perspective of the society, of the street, the popular perception. And I'm going to start by telling you a story that's always struck me. Shortly after the January 25th revolution, I attended an international conference held here in Washington, D.C. And on a panel, one of the panels featured a very prominent and very credible Egyptian human rights defender, an activist. And he shared something that I thought was very important. He said that human rights activists and democracy activists in Egypt had been documenting abuses by the police, by the security apparatus for literally decades. And they were sending these reports out, presenting them at international conferences, hoping that by exposing their government's atrocities against their own people, that the government would be embarrassed, or there would be international pressure on the government to reform, and that it never happened. But at that time, at the same time that these Egyptian human rights activists were documenting these atrocities and presenting at international conferences, they were completely ignoring the Egyptian people. Either they didn't have the mechanisms, or perhaps they didn't even have the motivation or the will to engage the Egyptian people themselves on the atrocities that were going on in the country that most simply were unaware of. And he said something very interesting. He said that when they finally switched strategies, when the human rights and democracy activists switched their target audience from the international community to the Egyptian people through now fabled social media and other strategies, through labor movements, and targeted the Egyptian people themselves and made them aware of the atrocities. We all know about the Facebook page, Kullina Khaled Saeed and others, that brought the human rights atrocities and the police brutality to the regular person in Egypt. He said only then did the government start to pay attention. It was only when we started to engage the Egyptian people that change became possible. And he credited that strategic shift with the success of the January 25th revolution. And why I think that's so striking is that the international community responds to the Egyptian people, and really not the other way around. That the international community simply does not have the attention span, the will, the energy, or even the incentive to make any kind of change or to demand any kind of change of the Egyptian government. And that they will only stand and support what they see as a real push from the street. And that explains why President Obama was essentially silent about democracy in Egypt until it became clear that to be on the right side of history, pretty much a few days after January 25th, 2011, he had to side with the people. And the reason I bring that up, and I start this talk with this story, is because I see the incredible instability, the state violence, and the repression in Egypt today as a symptom, as a result of a moral and spiritual crisis in Egyptian society. It's a very strong statement, probably quite unpopular. But if it wasn't for the deep polarization and incredible demonization of segments of society in Egypt, the kind of violence that we have witnessed simply would not be possible. This is popularly sanctioned state violence. And it's a terrible, ugly reality to face as someone born in Egypt, as an Egyptian American, to face that ugly reality. But it's one that we have to face. And so I think moving forward, the solution will have to include, in addition to all kinds of very important legal reform, it will have to include a deep societal transformation and reconciliation at the popular level. When you think about this polarization, when you think about this deep division in society, and how it really is the underlying cancer that is manifesting itself in all of these repressions and state violence, there's a number of reasons why the international community should care. In addition to the incredible instability in Egypt, that has ramifications across the region. There's the impact, the dire impact on the economy. Anyone who sees this kind of polarization that the coup of July 3rd both needed in order to happen, but also exacerbated, and thinks that this is going to bring stability, I mean, it's obviously wrong. With this kind of economic instability, social unrest will only increase. The other problem with this level of polarization is when it gives a license and when it creates an environment where there is such dire state repression and violence, as well as vigilante violence, it will inevitably create a climate whereby violent groups have a eager ear. And we've had several speakers talk about the danger of the existence and the danger of growth of violent ideologies in Egypt. That will affect not only Egypt, but the international community. The third reason I think that the international community should care about this kind of polarization is that throughout the year of Morsi's presidency and later, the faith of the Egyptian people eroded not only in Morsi's abilities as president, but I think much more importantly, in the democratic process in itself. So Gallup has been, which is of course the firm that I used to work for, had been conducting public opinion surveys in Egypt for years, including several during the time after the January 25th revolution. And what the analysis found was this, that initially people's faith in the honesty of elections was very high. Over 75% of Egyptians believed that the presidential election was fair and honest. Now, what's really important about that number is it's, of course, much, much higher than those who got the president they wanted. So even people who voted for a different presidential candidate believed that the presidential elections were fair and honest. That contrasts with only 20% who believed the same thing during the Mubarak era, and many of you might wonder who were those 20% who thought those elections were fair and honest. But they were there, and even under Mubarak, people expressed a skepticism as to the honesty of the elections. Now that 75% eroded to only a third of Egyptians who believed in the honesty of the presidential elections. Those same presidential elections, we didn't redo them, at the end of that year, shortly before the coup of July 3rd. So what had happened throughout that year, whether it's the events that took place in real life or a very activist media, it had succeeded in eroding people's faith in democracy itself, in the democratic process itself. Now, what had stayed solid in terms of confidence is people's confidence in the military. In fact, it is the institution in Egypt with the highest level of popular confidence. And so when you have this very uneven reality where democracy and the process, however flawed, that helps it move forward, has only a third of the population's confidence, while the military has close to 95% confidence, you have a situation where democratic institutions hardly have a chance. Now, the other thing that's really important about this confidence in in democratic institutions and the fact that that number had eroded over that year, is that that same analysis found that there was an empirical link between confidence in the honesty of elections and the belief that oppressed people can change their situation through peaceful means alone. So with the erosion of belief in elections and their honesty is also this erosion in belief of peaceful means alone. When the Egyptian people lose their faith in the democratic process, they're also losing their faith in the prospects of making change through peaceful means alone. And this is simply an empirical connection in the research. And the international community should be concerned about this. So what should pro-democracy groups do? And I think it is to address the deep polarization. The idea that a segment of Egyptians is literally subhuman, that they are not of us, they are not Egyptian. And that was the real danger of the rhetoric. It wasn't simply a criticism of policies, but it was the calling to question that some people among us aren't of us. They are un-Egyptian. Not only are they inferior to us, but they are not from us. So this division, I think, is the core of what the international community and pro-democracy groups must address to enable the prospect of a democratic future. And that means the emergence of moral leadership. Leadership like the late Nelson Mandela, people who can speak from the perspective of moral authority about a different way to speak. It also means enlarging the center, giving platforms to people who are not on either fringe, who are speaking, they could disagree, but they agree on rational debate and pluralism as an alternative to polarization, rather than this false notion of national unity. National unity sounds great on the outside or on the surface, but it's really code for silencing dissent. So I'll finish, I'll close by summarizing that in order to make a democratic future possible, international actors and pro-democracy groups have to work on creating an environment where polarization is replaced by pluralism. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dalia. Really wonderful points. There's so much to talk about, and all of our speakers have given us so much to speak about. So I want to move straight to our fourth speaker, who is such a joy for so many of us here who were worried about Dr. Imad Shaheen, to actually see him here live and in person, and we're looking forward to hearing your comments, Dr. Shaheen.
Thank you very much. Hopefully I can add to something substantial to the wonderful statements and the very significant presentation that we have heard so far. And I feel a little bit awkward because I'm supposed to focus on possible initiatives for national reconciliation, for restoring democracy, and for restoring social peace and stability to the country. And of course, what I'm going to say has to be controversial, especially when you try to provide concrete steps or even a vision for something that's really, at the moment, completely out of reach. But I'll give it a try. I have at least, or I have reviewed at least 25 to 30 initiatives for seeking national reconciliation after the coup, since July 3rd. I personally, and I think I can say that in public now, I personally drafted at least 4 or 5 of them. And according to one theory, that maybe my predicament, or this has been one of the reasons for my predicament, that trying, just to find some kind of a solution that can bring all the parties together. But I have to admit to you, out of the 25 or the 30 that I have seen, all have failed. All have failed. And they have failed for a number of reasons. Either the timing was not ripe, or the actors were not ready, or the balance of power between the different political forces was not conducive to a reconciliation. Like each side thought that it can get away with its own vision, its own plan, and it's powerful enough to eliminate or to resist the other side, the plan of the other side, to foil the plan of the other side. So what I will do today is I will try to put this discussion about initiatives within a larger framework. This larger framework can, of course, be helpful in guiding us on the elements that maybe are required to be included in an initiative, as well as, and this is of course for the youth, if we are trying, or if we choose to select the revolutionary path once again, and we try to restore or recreate the revolutionary moment in Egypt once again. I know this is not possible in the near future, but at least we can have some kind of vision about the elements that are, or the requirements that must exist in order to restore this revolutionary moment and effect some kind of change. I will do that by focusing, and again, bear with me, I know this is late in the afternoon, so I'll do that through focusing on 4 points that I felt now in retrospect we needed to study and we needed to investigate much more thoroughly than what we did. And I personally have to talk about myself. I'm not going to blame anyone, but I think I did not give these 4 elements enough attention, and maybe I underestimated also the resilience and the power of the state vis-a-vis the revolutionary forces and the revolution in general. Then I will conclude with the elements that need to, or that are required in any initiative. The 4 elements that I'm going to focus on are, and I know this will not sound very original, but at least I will share with you from my own personal perspective, from my own personal experience throughout the past 3 years, how I'm trying to have a fresh look at these elements. One, of course, is state-society relations, which is extremely important in taking into consideration when we are going to draw any initiative. The second issue is civil-military relations, because I believe the core of the problem has been our, again, how we underestimated the imbalance in the civil-military relations. Then the third element is the relation between the state and the concept of governance, or the type of regime that governs that state. And finally, civil-civil relations. So very briefly, of course, I have to address these issues. I know this, each one you can write volumes about each one of them. But at least, again, I will highlight the points that I came up with, and maybe in the future one can focus on in terms of trying to visualize how can we restore normalcy to the Egyptian situation. Now, the issue of the relationship between the state and society. Just to give credit to the revolutionaries, of course, one main slogan of the revolution was الشعب يريد إسقاط النظام. That was a raised slogan from the beginning, that the intention of that revolution, as it evolved and as the demands started to escalate, was to dismantle the old state. However, this did not take place. The revolution did not move far enough for a number of reasons. We can, again, go into the blaming game because you did not join us, or, again, if we would like to reverse this logic, because we were not strong enough to do it on our own. So we needed you. But at the same time, we have to undermine you and just calling you for help whenever we want, and then discard of you whenever we don't want or need your assistance, and so on. So that was one. But I think a more essential problem was that the revolution itself did not have a political vision or a political framework from day one, even in pursuing its very general objectives, economic growth, human dignity, and so on, and freedoms, it did not have a clear vision or a framework how to achieve these objectives. And that was, of course, a major problem in the evolution or the development of that revolution. Also, there was an underestimation of the fact that the state had its own custodians, that they were willing to protect it and to defend it to the last minute. So if we can come up with a new law like the law of gravity, for each revolution, there is a watchful, fierce, and vicious counter-revolution that sees you, they see you, but you cannot see them. And this is exactly what happened. Another issue, of course, that in the relation between the state and society was the understanding of the nature of the Egyptian state itself. I know Egyptians are very proud of making everything unique about themselves, but I think here we really are talking about a unique situation of a state that's extremely old, well entrenched, old as 1818, and this is again something unique about the Egyptians. 1818 marks the true emergence of a modern state in Egypt, with elaborate institutions, departments, specialization, hierarchy, and so on. Under Muhammad Ali, 1818. And 1919, a century later, marks the emergence of a true Egyptian identity. So the state preceded the identity, the nation in Egypt. But this is something, we can talk about that not within the 10 minutes. But anyway, so this state, one can claim that despite the phases, because this is a very controversial issue. It's it's fierce, but weak, it's dismantled, it's not a state. Yes, but it was continuous. It has been continuous all along. And I will give you just one example. The official gazette that still people look at now, اللي هي الجريدة الرسمية. Even after the revolution, the official gazette or the جريدة الرسمية became very important. Because is the last decree of the SCAF, was it published on that date or not? Was it included in the official gazette or not? That's Muhammad Ali. That's the state of Muhammad Ali. This is the official gazette of Muhammad Ali, the founder of modern Egypt. This is just one example, and I can cite so many examples. So the question here is, how can we, in any initiative, in any attempt to restore a revolutionary movement once again, how can we deal with this long and old state? Even if it's weak, but it's continuous, it's very deep. The other side, of course, is society. Two discoveries, and I'm sorry to say that, at least I'm talking about myself, by the way. I'm not, like talking about anybody else or anyone else's discoveries. We held so many stereotypes about the Egyptian society. This is a very religious society. It's a very peaceful, we are very peaceful people. No, we're not like the Algerians, with all respect to the Algerians. We never get into killing and bloodshed and so on, and I think this was something that has to be re-examined. Something happened to the political culture, as Dalia Mogahed said, the political culture of Egyptians. The other thing, of course, is to what extent is this society willing or able to work, live independently of that state? Islam Lutfi said, we don't have civil society. ما فيش حاجة اسمها مجتمع مدني. ضعيف. True. And at the same time, this society, this مجتمع, gave the revolutionaries, took the risk, and gave the revolutionaries the benefit of the doubt in the beginning. And then when they saw that nothing was really happening, they immediately tilted towards the state. And hence, of course, this acceptance or the popularity of state violence and so on. The media, NGOs, the judiciary, even the people themselves sided with the state against any change. The second point is the civil-military relations. This is an old, of course, topic, but maybe there is something that I discovered I was not aware of. We all talked about, that Egypt is owned by the military. It's founded upon the military institution since the time of Muhammad Ali. But there is a new discovery that I found out. The military in Egypt is not only an institution, and it's not only a strong institution, it's a class. I always taught my students that the class concept has to be looked at very carefully in the Middle East because it's always mitigated by other things. Religion, your sect, your region, your faction, where you are coming from, and so on. This is the only class that is based on ownership, 20, 30, 40% of the economy, according to estimates, that has consciousness. There is a consciousness, very strong, that we own the country. Any president who's coming to rule Egypt, whether it's Mubarak, whether it's secular, whether it's Morsi, Islamist, and so on, has to realize this fact and has to take the military as the core ruling institution in the country. That was leaked in the conversation or the interview, the famous interview, and so on. It's also a class because of the ownership, the consciousness, and the type of alliances it has built with that entrenched state, with a community of businessmen or businesswomen, with the regional and international community, business community. This is, for me, was something new, for example. I always thought it was a strong institution. No, you are talking about a class in the absence of other counterbalancing classes with the same entrenchment, with the same level of ownership or the same consciousness. I have to move on. I have a lot of points, but the third issue is, of course, the relation between the state institutions and the regime. I also discovered new things over the past 3 years. We all teach that the state should be a rational entity, it should be neutral, should be above all ideologies, and should be to the service of any regime, regardless. The state should serve the administration, regardless of the ideological preference or bias of that administration. In Egypt, the situation, of course, is different, and this is not new. But the idea that the state, this is what's new is after 1952, this merge between the state and the regime became very clear. It was not before. And those, for example, who watch the black and white television, the films, Egyptian films and so on, can realize this. That the state employee or the civil servant was really serving the state, not the king, not the regime itself. After 1952, this really has changed. And what has changed is that all the state was also reduced into, the word I would like to use, I will use in Arabic because it's more أجهزة, entities, like Iraqi state, like the militia state of Qaddafi, like the militia state of Syria, and so on, entities. So the entities are the security, the military, the judiciary, the bureaucracy, of course, that of course caused much of, or many of the Now the question is, having said that, and sometimes I ask myself this question, if Baradei, or if we all aligned behind Baradei and pushed Baradei and elected Baradei as president, or Abdel Menem Abu Futuh, Morsi was not in the picture. The Muslim Brotherhood were not in the picture. And these individuals, these newly elected presidents tried to stand against the state, against these entities. What would have happened to them? Could they have succeeded to challenge that state and get their programs in effect? I believe that Morsi did not fail, or fall, I'm sorry. Morsi did not fall because of the demonstrations. Morsi fell and was failed because of this state. So any initiative, any attempt to restore the revolutionary moment, of course, has to take that into consideration. Anyone who comes from any background, revolutionary or whatever, thank you, has to take that into consideration. And the question then is, what do we do with this situation within any initiative or attempt to restore the revolutionary movement? Finally, the civil relations. We talked about the polarization all day long, but this is really unprecedented. The intensity of that polarization is really unprecedented. The propensity for violence throughout the 1 year or 2 years or whatever, and now this idea, contemplation of peaceful has not worked, and peaceful strategy has not worked, and then we have to resort to the violence, is extremely dangerous on everybody's part, especially the those who would like to effect a change in the country. This movement, this revolution, has to remain peaceful no matter what. No matter what. So the civil relations is a very important issue because there is a high level of polarization. What are we going to do about this in any initiative? We went through identity wars over the past 3 years. There is ideological, of course, biases and preferences. And there is a need, as a result, to at least emphasize the need for respect of pluralism, and rule of law. Now, finally, I'll conclude the initiative, because that's the issue that I'm supposed to talk about. Any initiative, of course, has to look at the current situation and where Egypt is heading. Sisi, when he came to, or he made his coup, he justified that coup on a number of issues or myths or fallacies, whatever they are. That he prevented a civil war. Morsi had to be removed because in order to prevent a civil war, to bring peace and social order to the country, and to bring stability. So that was one strategy. That was one raison d'etre behind that coup. The second one was the roadmap, that we are not seizing power in order to rule, but we are putting forward a roadmap after which Egypt will, or democracy will be restored in Egypt. I would claim, without going into the details, but I have to justify why I'm making this claim, that both have failed. Sisi's strategies bet on bringing Egyptians into subjugation, killing 5,000, 2,000, whatever the number is, even though a single individual is very precious, but his bet on killing and killing and killing until everybody comes to subjugation is failing. Then what is he going to do? This is a very simple question I would like to ask him. Are you going to kill 5,000 more? Are we going to 10,000 more? There must be an end to this. So his strategy of bringing stability, no, he hasn't brought stability, despite all this killing. The country is more polarized than before, and the country on the verge of more violence and civil war. And then we come to the roadmap. It's a sham. The referendum was a sham. In every respect, in terms of process, content, procedure, the referendum itself, and I'm going to go through this, but I can discuss that with anyone afterwards. I tell you exactly where the forging the results have taken place. So he's becoming a president soon, if he finally decides to run and ends this mystery. And then he has to consolidate, definitely he has to consolidate power. But that will not be easy for him, because the only way he will consolidate power is that he needs some kind of an apparatus, a vehicle, to use in order to build support and new power base. You see, I said new power base. He doesn't have this new power base. So he has two options, either to rely on Mubarak's men, the old system, and he started to do this, but at some point he will feel uncomfortable with this. He wants to be his own man, his own leader. He wants to ensure the loyalty of everybody. He makes these people and so on. And I don't think he has much maneuverability, because we all know, since Gamal Mubarak, the state as such has been bankrupt to produce and recruit new and fresh initiatives and blood and so on. So he will consolidate, maybe pursue more repression, at least for 1 or 2 years, and then, given the state of the economy, the state of the popular protest, namely the youth movement that's now not accepting all this, Harakat al-Shababiyya, also the collapse of law and order, the lack of recognition, the disgusting measures that he's taking and the draconian measures that he is taking, so he has to open up. Now, this is the military, which is a main force. I will conclude. On the other hand, you have the political forces. And if you wish, at the front of these political forces, the coalition, the Islamists, that can mobilize and have the numbers and so on. They have two alternatives. One is to reconcile and go back to a Mubarak-style containment or relationship with the regime, meaning that you accept marginal to be integrated, but under certain or within a certain margin, or you pursue a revolutionary path in this case. You continue with the revolution. which seems to be happening so far, at least for the coming year or two. There is no political opening being offered by the regime, so the only alternative is to keep mobilizing and to keep peaceful protests. Hashd, ta'bi'ah. You keep doing this all the time in order to weaken the grip of the state and that state. Now, the way out of this, either, no matter what path this political force will choose, has to be based on a number of things, the core of which is building a broad civil coalition to counterbalance the military and to force it to at least back up a little bit. Whether you go conciliatory, democratic path, or you go revolutionary path, this coalition has to be built. Now, the elements for that initiative has to consist of three. And I'm going to list them because they are self-explanatory, more or less. Three components. One, self-criticism on everybody's part. Everybody improvised through this revolution throughout the 3 years. Everybody made mistakes. Everybody. And everybody has to be accountable for these mistakes. And now is better than, or soon better than later. The second one is the broad civil coalition. This has to be built on common objective and shared vision. Not like before, that you go and the objective will be just to change, but you don't know what you are trying to build. And in this case, the objective should be based on the restoration of civilian control over the democratic process. And the vision should be based on a national plan for economic recovery, restoring security and stability, social justice, and transitional justice. These are the big frameworks. There are so many details. We have been working on this actually for at least 6 or 8 months, even before the coup. So there are so many details. I don't want to bug you with details now, but at least the details of these frameworks has to be negotiated, back to my initial introduction, with the state, with the military, with the other civil forces, and of course with the entities that I referred to. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shaheen. And now we will hear from Nahla Nasser. Thank you for stepping in at the last minute.
Hello, everyone. I apologize in advance if my speech is not very well structured. I just found out that I would speak today, so didn't have that much time to plan. So today I would like to speak more about my experience in Rabaa, since I spent quite a lot of time in most of the days in Rabaa, and actually explain a little bit about what I learned about the significance of the international community on Egypt. So first of all, I would like to speak about my personal experience. So why did I go to Rabaa? I mean, when I first got to Egypt, and a lot of people would say to me, you're French, and you live in a clean country with no garbage on the streets. Why would you join a protest in 45-degree weather during Ramadan with sticky people all around you, sweating? I don't understand. And so I learned this mentality about the Egyptians, that if it doesn't affect you, why bother? If you can go somewhere else, why bother go to somewhere you don't have to go? So as an Egyptian youth, I have witnessed that the newborn democracy in Egypt, and unfortunately I also witnessed the assassination of our newborn dream. So after having voted 5 times after the military coup, I obviously was very disappointed with the mentality of the Egyptian people, especially the higher class, who constantly told me, no, the military intervention is helping democracy go back to the path of democracy. And obviously I didn't believe them. And then when I told them this is not correct, they were like, well, you don't even live in Egypt, so you don't know anything about what happened in Egypt. And so I tell them, well, I think I know more about democracy than you, since I've lived in international countries my entire life, and I have experienced democracy everywhere I lived. So it doesn't mean that if I live in a French in France that I don't want democracy for Egypt, especially since, well, my country in France, more than 80% of the people don't even want our president. So it doesn't mean that we're going to carry out a military coup against him either. So I feel like Egypt has gone through a phase of incredible realization. The deep state is larger than anticipated, with huge interest for the status quo to continue. The coup showed the hidden hands who were playing behind the creation of conflict. Therefore, having this knowledge in place presents a youth very much aware of these realities and how to address them in the future. So, I mean, I wasn't really politically active before the revolution, to be honest. I'm not a political expert, but everything I experienced in Egypt gave me such a significant knowledge about how politics is supposed to carry out, what freedom really is, and what democracy really is. And so a nation that encountered no political participation by the public for over 80 years, it needs trial and error, and we should not be worried about making mistakes. So what do we need to ensure that the democratic process continues? So what I want to really speak about is more the role of pro-democracy movements in the international community, not and the international community. So I believe that the pro-democracy movements in the international community are actually very significant to increase the morale of the Egyptian people on the streets of Egypt. We know that the pro-democracy movements are in Egypt domestically are siding currently with the military. They are not objective and they are not principled. They are driven out of fear and hatred of the Islamists, which in my opinion disqualifies them from being true and valid organizations. So we have to focus more on the international pro-democracy movements, because obviously internationally you have more freedom and more and a larger more freedom, basically. So basically, what is our role in the international organizations? What do we do in order to reach democracy? So basically, the role of the pro-democracy movements is to persuade the international organizations to practice what they preach and support restoring democracy in Egypt. The silence of the international communities has been interpreted by the coup government as a green light to commit further massacres. So how do we restore democracy? I feel like there are 5 different freedoms that we need to restore in Egypt in order to take a step forward towards a democratic society. So first of all, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of assembly, freedom to petition government. So why these 5 different freedoms? So first of all, freedom of religion. The coup government is using the Coptic Church and Al-Azhar to attack the opposition and legitimize their killings, even though during the Morsi regime they accuse the Brotherhood of using religion to their own interest. So it's pretty much contradictory on their behalf. The mosques are severely under surveillance to the extent that Friday sermons are even limited. The imams are not allowed to say everything that they usually say. Freedom of speech. Obviously, you can't speak out against the current regime without being killed or jailed. And I actually learned that in Rabaa, because I left the house every day, people telling me, well, you might get killed, or we'd get little leaflets in the square saying, we are going to come for you, we are going to attack the Midan, we're going to disperse the Midan, so be careful. If you leave now, you will leave in peace, unharmed. So obviously there's obviously a lack of freedom of speech. So that needs to be restored in order to go back on the path of democracy. Freedom of press. I remember the first moment that we watched the Sisi make his speech, all the Islamist channels were literally in 10 seconds shut down. So during his speech, they shut down all the opposition channels. So and also the journalists are detained. There's subjective biased daily news, even news that about me personally in Rabaa. I'll tell you a little story very quickly about the first time I went on stage in Rabaa. The next day, a bunch of articles came out about making fun of my pants and saying that I was a paid Muslim Brotherhood agent to get on stage and to speak 3 different languages to ask for international intervention and to speak out to the different governments across the world. So, I mean, I found that pretty funny, but...
Fit the profile.
Yeah. But it just kind of shows the extent that the press will go to in Egypt. Yeah. Anyways, freedom of assembly. So obviously everyone knows about the protest law that recently passed. If you're more than 10 people to assemble in anywhere in Egypt, you'll either be arrested or you will be killed, obviously. So you will coincide with severe consequences, and I believe that it's very crucial that freedom of assembly that they allow freedom of assembly in order to allow freedom of speech as well. So freedom to petition government. So obviously you can't really ask the government to help if one of your friends is killed by a security force. If you go to the government and ask them for their help, I'm pretty sure that they're going to detain you or even kill you as well. So there's no freedom to petition the government. So I believe that the international community has a very significant role in order to help Egypt back on the path of democracy. So first of all, they have to condemn the atrocities, all the human rights violations, because their silence is allowing the current government to continue their atrocities without being harmed. And a positive democratic system for long-term stability. So I believe that that the international community is very important for change in Egypt, and I think that's all I would like to say.